Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us get back to our main character. The gray sky hung low over Manhattan that morning, heavy with mist, as Evelyn Hart tightened the scarf around her neck and pushed through the rain towards St. Benedict's Cathedral. The funeral was supposed to be quiet, intimate, yet reporters hovered behind the gates, hoping for a glimpse of the late tech billionaire, Alexander Hale, except there was no body. Only an empty casket draped in white lilies and a portrait of a man who had died in a plane crash a week earlier. Evelyn had never met him in life. She was a professional eulogy writer, someone who helped grieving families find words when they had none. But this commission felt different. Hale Industries had contacted her directly, requesting absolute confidentiality. They sent files, interviews, even his last public speech. What kind of man leaves behind this many words, she wondered, yet none of them sound like him. Inside, the organ played softly as mourners in black filled the pews. Evelyn stood near the pulpit, fingers trembling around the folded pages in her hand. She had written about hundreds of strangers, but never someone so famous, so untouchable. The church lights dimmed, and her voice, steady but fragile, filled the silence. Alexander Hale, she began, was a man who built worlds out of code and courage. He believed progress was purpose, and kindness, though hidden, was never weakness. Her tone softened. But even visionaries get tired of carrying the world alone. Her voice cracked slightly, and she drew a slow breath. Maybe what we call an ending is only a pause before something new begins. As the last words echoed through the cathedral, a rustle swept the crowd. A faint whisper turned into a gasp near the back doors. Evelyn glanced up, startled, just as the great wooden doors creaked open. Raindrops and light spilled in, framing a tall figure in a dark coat, face shadowed, alive. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then someone whispered, "It is him." Her pulse froze. The man in the doorway stepped forward, removing his gloves with deliberate calm. Alexander Hale, alive, very much alive. Murmurs erupted, cameras flashed, and Evelyn's paper slipped from her fingers, scattering her own words across the marble floor. He looked straight at her, eyes unreadable, then passed her to the coffin that was supposed to hold his remains. "You wrote my eulogy," he said quietly, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. "I suppose I should thank you for keeping it short." The irony in his tone cut through the tension like glass. Evelyn's knees nearly buckled. She had written his death and now he was standing right in front of her. The rain outside intensified, thunder rolling above the city as if the sky itself could not decide whether to mourn or rejoice. She did not know it yet, but this was the moment her life and his would never be the same again. The church erupted into chaos. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and the echo of thunder rolled through the stained glass windows as if the heavens themselves could not comprehend what they were witnessing. Evelyn stood frozen beside the pulpit, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Alexander Hale was alive. The man she had just eulogized was walking toward her, real, breathing, dripping rainwater onto the marble aisle. Security tried to intervene, but he raised a hand, calm and steady. "It is fine," he said, his voice low but firm. "I can handle it." His eyes flicked to her, then to the crumpled pages scattered around her feet. "You wrote beautiful words," he murmured. "Even if they were premature." She could not find her voice to reply. By the time the press realized what was happening, he had already disappeared through a side door, leaving pandemonium in his wake. Hours later, the city was on fire with speculation. Headlines screamed across every screen, "Billionaire back from the dead, Alexander Hale fakes death." Funeral turns to scandal. Outside her small apartment, Evelyn could hear the sirens and traffic blending with the hum of the rain. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone, the notification light blinking endlessly. A new message appeared from an unknown number. Miss Hart. Alexander Hale would like to meet you. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. Hale Tower. She read it 3 times, unsure if it was real. The next morning, Manhattan glittered under the wet light of dawn. The towering glass headquarters of Hale Industries pierced the fog like a blade. Evelyn clutched her worn leather bag tighter as she entered the lobby. Everything gleamed: polished marble, gold accents, walls of screens flashing stock data and innovation campaigns. The receptionist, crisp in a navy suit, greeted her without expression. "Mr. Hale is expecting you." The elevator ride felt endless. Her reflection stared back at her in the mirrored walls, nervous eyes, trembling hands, the faint smudge of sleeplessness beneath them. When the doors opened, the penthouse floor stretched out in glass and silence. And there he was. Alexander Hale stood by the window, looking out at the skyline that had mourned him. He turned when he heard her steps. "You came," he said simply. She nodded, uncertain. "You asked." He studied her for a long moment. "You wrote about me like you knew me. You described kindness I did not think anyone saw." She hesitated. "It was just a job, Mr. Hale. I wrote what people told me." "People tell you what they remember," he said softly, "but you wrote what I forgot." He gestured for her to sit. The desk between them was covered in legal papers and thick folders. "The world thinks I am dead," he continued. "Some of my board would prefer it stayed that way. But a company cannot function when its CEO is a ghost. I need someone to help me appear alive." Evelyn blinked, confused. "You want me to write another speech?" He shook his head slowly. "Not exactly. I need a partner. A wife. Temporarily." Her mouth fell open. "Excuse me? The media will not believe my return unless there is stability, something human to anchor it. You were at the funeral. You were on every camera. You spoke for me. That makes you the perfect narrative." She stared at him, stunned. "You want a fake marriage." "A contract marriage," he corrected, his tone pragmatic. 3 months. Public appearances only. You will be compensated, and your reputation will be protected." Evelyn rose from her chair, disbelief flooding her. "You cannot be serious." "I am," he said calmly. "I have already been to my own funeral, Miss Hart. Pretending to be married is hardly the strangest thing I have done." She turned toward the elevator, needing air, needing distance, but his next words stopped her cold. "You have already written my ending," he said quietly. "Do not walk away before you see how the story really begins." Her hand trembled against the button. She did not turn around. "You are out of your mind," she whispered, and left. But even as she stepped into the sunlight outside Hale Tower, she could still hear his voice in her head. In a small, treacherous part of her wondered what kind of man came back from the dead just to ask a stranger to be his wife. Evelyn spent the night turning his words over in her head. "You have already written my ending. Do not walk away before you see how the story really begins." It replayed like an echo she could not silence. By dawn, the city outside her window was waking, horns and footsteps and the hum of 1,000 lives moving forward, yet she felt suspended in one impossible moment. Logic told her to forget him, to delete that message, to stay invisible. But curiosity, that dangerous pulse beneath her ribs, whispered otherwise. At 9:59, she stood again in the glass lobby of Hale Tower. This time, she was expected. An assistant escorted her to the top floor, where Alexander was already seated at a long table with his attorney. "Miss Hart," he greeted, his voice even, as if yesterday's shock had never happened. "Please, sit. We have terms to discuss." She hesitated, but curiosity anchored her to the chair. The attorney slid a folder toward her. "This outlines the agreement," he explained. "Duration 3 months. Conditions: shared residence for public credibility, joint appearances at select events, no physical expectations beyond what is necessary for media presentation. Financial compensation is detailed on page 4. Evelyn flipped through the pages. Each line was precise, emotionless, clinical. "So you want me to be your wife," she said finally, "but only on paper." Alexander met her eyes. "In public, yes. Privately, nothing changes. You live as you wish. It is a transaction, Miss Hart, not a vow." "And if I refuse?" she asked. "Then you will still be tied to the headlines as the woman who eulogized a man who was never dead," he said, his tone factual, not cruel. "This arrangement protects you as much as it does me." The logic was brutal and true. The tabloids had already torn her name apart. She exhaled slowly, feeling the walls close in. "This is insane," she murmured. "Probably," he said with a faint, humorless smile. "But insanity is underrated." His confidence unsettled her, not arrogance but something else, a quiet certainty that he could bend reality to his will. "Why me?" she asked at last. "Out of all the people you could have chosen?" His answer was simple. "Because you already spoke as if you knew my soul. You made strangers cry for me, Miss Hart. That is power I cannot manufacture." The attorney cleared his throat. "We will need both signatures today if the press conference tomorrow is to proceed." Evelyn stared at the pen. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Every rational cell screamed to run, but the other part, the writer, the dreamer, the woman who had looked into a coffin that held nothing, wondered what story might unfold if she said yes. Finally, she picked up the pen. 3 months, she said quietly. "After that, we go our separate ways." "Agreed," Alexander said. His hand brushed hers briefly as they both signed, the contact fleeting but electric. He stood, extending his hand. "Welcome to the most unconventional marriage Manhattan has ever seen." The words felt surreal as they descended the elevator together, the world outside unaware that a contract had just been signed between life and fiction. Outside the building, a black car waited. His driver opened the door, and Alexander gestured for her to enter. "Your residence will be the penthouse until further notice," he said. "The media will expect photographs of us together. We will start with dinner tonight." "Dinner," she repeated, almost laughing. "That is part of the performance?" "Everything is part of the performance," he replied, his gaze steady. "But that does not mean it cannot be real." She had no answer to that. As the car pulled into the stream of traffic, Evelyn looked at the skyline ahead, glittering and cold, and wondered when exactly her life had stopped belonging to her and how a story she had written to honor the dead had turned into the script of her own uncertain future. The penthouse was unlike anything Evelyn had ever seen. It was perched above the city like a glass palace, filled with sharp lines and silence that hummed louder than any machine. When she first walked in, she could almost hear her own footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Alexander followed behind her, his presence commanding yet strangely distant. "This will be your home," he said. "Your room is down the hall. Everything you need has been arranged." She nodded, still unsure how to respond. The space felt sterile, like a museum curated by ghosts. No family photos, no trace of life, just power and perfection. Later that evening, she found herself staring out at the skyline from the balcony. Below, Manhattan pulsed with noise and motion, a world she no longer felt part of. "You are not comfortable here," his voice said behind her. She turned to see him standing at the door, a glass of water in his hand. "I am fine," she replied softly. "It just feels unreal." He stepped closer, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. "That makes 2 of us." It was the first hint of vulnerability she had seen from him. Then, his tone shifted back to business. "Tomorrow morning, a stylist will come. They will prepare you for our public dinner. It is important the press sees us as compatible." "Compatible," she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You mean believable." Believable, he agreed, a small smirk tugging at his mouth. You have a sharp tongue, Miss Hart. That may actually work in our favor. The next morning came too soon. Evelyn woke to find the penthouse bustling with assistants and stylists. Dresses, jewelry, and makeup filled the room like a movie set. She let them transform her, her reflection turning into someone she barely recognized, poised, polished, elegant. When she stepped out, Alexander was waiting by the door in a tailored black suit. His gaze lingered a moment longer than she expected. You clean up well, he said. She met his eyes, half amused, half nervous. I could say the same. The dinner that evening was a blur of flashbulbs, clinking glasses, and carefully staged smiles. They sat side by side at the restaurant's private table, pretending to be newlyweds still wrapped in the glow of affection. But between the flashes of cameras and murmurs of the crowd, Evelyn caught moments of quiet, his hand steadying her glass, his voice low as he guided her through the chaos. Just breathe, he whispered once when a reporter asked too personal a question. We are selling a story, not living one. But deep down, she wondered if he believed that. After the interviews ended, they stepped out into the cool night air. The photographers were gone, the city quiet again. You handled that well, he said as they walked toward the waiting car. I did not faint, so that is progress, she replied, smiling despite herself. You were perfect, he said, then quickly looked away as if the admission had slipped. In the car, silence stretched between them. The city lights flickered across his face, highlighting a weariness she had not noticed before. Without thinking, she asked, Why did you fake your death, Alexander? His jaw tightened. It was not fake, he said quietly. The crash was real. I survived when I should not have. The board decided the company needed a clean narrative, so they buried me. Easier to mourn a myth than manage a man. Evelyn's heart clenched at the calm bitterness in his tone. And now you are back from the grave, she said softly. Does it feel like living again? He turned to her, eyes unreadable. I have not decided yet. When they returned to the penthouse, he paused at her door. You did well tonight, Evelyn. Thank you. She nodded. Good night, Mr. Hale. Alexander, he corrected. If we are going to fool the world, you should at least use my name. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. Good night, Alexander. He watched her disappear behind the door, the faint sound of her laughter lingering in the hall longer than he expected. For the first time since the crash, Alexander Hale felt the city breathe again, and somewhere deep inside, something that had been long dead began to stir. By the second week, the performance had become a routine. Breakfasts staged by the panoramic windows, meetings where they arrived hand in hand, polite laughter exchanged in front of cameras. Every gesture rehearsed, every smile timed. Yet behind the facade, something unspoken began to shift. Evelyn no longer flinched when he brushed her arm to guide her through a crowd, and Alexander had stopped calling her Miss Hart. They were learning each other's rhythms, even if neither dared to name it. One afternoon, as they prepared for an upcoming charity gala, she found him in his study, staring at a small photograph on his desk. It was worn at the edges, a younger version of him standing beside an older man. Your father, she asked quietly. He looked up, startled, then nodded. He built this company from nothing. Died 5 years ago. I still catch myself trying to prove something to him. His tone was flat, but the sadness underneath it was real. And do you feel like you have? She asked. He gave a hollow laugh. No. I think I just learned how to hide the feeling of failure better. Evelyn hesitated, then stepped closer. Maybe you do not need to prove anything to anyone. Maybe surviving was enough. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw gratitude in his eyes. Later that evening, the gala was a whirlwind of glittering gowns and endless flashes. Reporters crowded near the red carpet, calling their names. Alexander's hand found hers as they stepped into the light. Ready, he whispered. As I will ever be, she answered, forcing a smile. Inside the ballroom, chandeliers blazed like constellations. The event was to benefit Hale Foundation's new education initiative, and Alexander was expected to deliver a speech confirming his return. When the host introduced them, the crowd erupted in applause. Alexander stepped up to the podium, his voice steady, his presence magnetic. For a while, he began, I believed my story had ended. But sometimes, the world gives us a second chance not to relive what we lost, but to remember why we began. The words drew soft murmurs of approval. Then he turned slightly toward Evelyn, a subtle but unmistakable gesture that made the audience lean in. And I have been reminded that stories are not finished by endings, but by those who help us find new beginnings. Cameras clicked wildly. Evelyn's heart skipped. He was looking directly at her, and for a brief, dizzying moment, the world fell away. When he returned to the table, she whispered, "You did not tell me you were going to say that." "It was not planned," he said simply. "You inspired it." The gala continued late into the night. They danced once, under the golden light of the chandeliers, surrounded by whispers and curious glances. His hand rested lightly on her waist, hers on his shoulder. "For a fake marriage, we are quite convincing," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Convincing enough to confuse even myself," he replied. It was meant to be a joke, but the way he said it made her pulse quicken. When they finally returned to the penthouse, the city spread beneath them in silence. She turned to thank him for the evening, but before she could speak, he said, "You were extraordinary tonight. You make this look easy." "It is not," she admitted. Pretending to be someone's wife, smiling for cameras, lying with every breath, it is exhausting. "You are not lying," he said quietly. "You are surviving. There is a difference." His words lingered as she walked down the hall. That night, she could not sleep. From her room, she heard faint piano notes drifting through the walls, slow, hesitant, like someone rediscovering a forgotten language. Without thinking, she followed the sound to his study. Alexander sat at the grand piano, fingers tracing the keys. He looked up when she entered but did not speak. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not know you played." "I stopped years ago," he said. "After my father died, the music felt pointless." She hesitated, then sat beside him. "Play something for him. Or for you. Or maybe for us." He glanced at her, then began to play a quiet, trembling melody that filled the room with something almost holy. For the first time since the crash, Alexander Hale felt alive, and Evelyn realized she was falling for a man who did not believe in life after death until now. The days that followed the gala blurred into something softer, something neither of them dared to define. Their routine still looked the same on paper: shared appearances, polite interviews, rehearsed gestures, but behind the polished surface, the boundaries of their contract began to blur. Alexander had started waiting for her at breakfast, making her coffee exactly the way she liked it, 1 sugar, no cream. Evelyn found herself leaving little notes by his desk, reminders for meetings, quotes from books she thought he might like. The penthouse no longer felt sterile. It began to sound like life again. One night, rain drummed against the glass walls as lightning streaked across the city. Evelyn stood on the balcony, letting the cool wind brush her hair. She heard his voice behind her. "You should not stand out there. The storm will get worse." She turned, smiling faintly. "You worry too much for a man who has already survived death." He stepped closer, the thunder rumbling above them. "I was not afraid of dying," he said quietly. "I was afraid of living without purpose." She met his gaze. "And have you found one now?" His eyes softened. "Maybe." The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. The next morning, Evelyn was scheduled to appear with him at a board meeting to present the foundation's next project. She dressed carefully, reminding herself this was still an arrangement, nothing more. But when she entered the conference room, the air was different. Alexander was already seated at the head of the table, surrounded by the board members who once thought him dead. The tension was palpable. One of the executives, a cold-eyed man named Victor Lang, leaned back in his chair. "We appreciate your resurrection, Alexander," he said with thinly veiled sarcasm. "But your decision-making has become unpredictable. Announcing a new charity division without approval? Bringing a writer with no corporate experience into executive meetings? It makes people question your stability." Evelyn stiffened. Alexander's expression remained calm, but his voice was sharp. "Miss Hart's insight is invaluable. She understands people, something we have forgotten while chasing profit." "She is your wife," Victor sneered. "Of course you would say that." The room fell silent. Evelyn opened her mouth, but Alexander spoke first. "Fake or not, she has done more for this company's humanity in 3 weeks than some of you have in years." The words stunned her as much as the others. After the meeting, as they walked down the corridor, she said softly, "You did not have to defend me." "Yes, I did," he replied. "They think I am still the man who only built walls. You remind me there is another way." She looked up at him, her heart pounding in ways she did not want to understand. That night, they attended another event together, but this time the smiles were not rehearsed. When the cameras were gone and the music faded, Alexander suggested a walk. They strolled through Central Park, the city glowing in the distance. "When this is over," he said, "what will you do?" She hesitated. "I do not know. Go back to writing, maybe. Something honest. Something that does not feel borrowed." He nodded. "You could stay," he said quietly. "The contract will end, but it does not mean we have to." She looked at him, trying to read his face. Is that the billionaire talking, or the man who plays piano at 2 in the morning? "Maybe both," he said with a faint smile. The wind lifted her hair, and for a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he stepped back, as if afraid to break the spell. "Good night, Evelyn," he said softly. "Good night, Alexander." But long after she returned to her room, she could still feel the warmth of his gaze. The next morning, when she woke, the space beside the piano held a single objective page from her old eulogy draft, folded neatly, with 4 words written in his handwriting, "Still learning to live." And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, so was she. The illusion of calm did not last. The following week, the tabloids exploded with headlines that turned their fragile peace into chaos. Someone had leaked the marriage contract. Every network repeated the same story: Alexander Hale's fake wife exposed, the eulogy writer who sold her soul. Evelyn's phone lit up with hundreds of messages, half cruel, half curious. Reporters camped outside the penthouse, shouting questions through the rain. She stood by the window, pale and trembling, watching the storm build below. Alexander burst into the room, holding a printed article. His expression was unreadable. "Do you know anything about this?" he asked, voice low but taut. She shook her head. "Of course not. Why would I?" He tossed the paper onto the table. "Victor Lang. He had access to everything. He wants me removed from the board, and this is the perfect weapon." "Then tell them the truth," she said. "Tell them we are not a scandal." "It will not matter," he muttered, pacing. "In this world, perception is truth." Evelyn's voice rose. "And what about my life? They are calling me a fraud, Alexander. My clients dropped me. I cannot even walk outside." He turned sharply. "You knew what this was. You signed it." The words hit harder than he intended. The silence that followed was heavy, raw. Her voice broke when she answered. "Yes, I did. But I did not sign up to be disposable." She walked past him, grabbed her coat, and headed for the elevator. "Evelyn," he called after her, but she did not stop. The doors closed, leaving him staring at his own reflection, realizing too late that the only thing real in his carefully crafted world was walking away. Hours passed. The penthouse felt colder than before. He sat alone at the piano, her folded note still on the keys. Outside, the city lights blurred through the rain. He remembered the night she told him that surviving was enough. For the first time, the silence around him felt unbearable. Meanwhile, Evelyn wandered through the streets without direction, her phone still buzzing in her pocket. She ended up at the small cafe where she had written his eulogy months ago. The waitress recognized her instantly but said nothing, only offered her a cup of coffee and a kind smile. Evelyn sat there, staring at the steam rising from the cup, feeling the weight of everything collapsing. She had written about love and redemption for strangers all her life but never imagined becoming the tragedy of her own story. When she returned home that night, the building lobby was packed with reporters. Cameras flashed, voices shouted her name, but she pushed through, head high, silent. In the elevator, her hands trembled, but her eyes were dry. She was done pretending. Upstairs, Alexander sat at his desk, still in the same position, when the front door opened. For a heartbeat, he thought he had imagined it. She stood in the doorway, drenched, exhausted, but fierce. "If you want to save your company," she said quietly, "you need to stop lying to them, to yourself, to me." He rose, speechless, but she was already walking toward the guest room. "Good night, Alexander," she said, her tone calm but final. For the first time, the man who had faced death realized what true fear felt like, the fear of losing someone still alive. Alexander did not sleep that night. The rain outside faded into a gray morning, but the hollow ache in his chest remained. He replayed every word she had said, each one cutting deeper because it was true. By noon, the scandal had reached its peak. Stock prices dropped, sponsors pulled back, and Victor Lang had officially called for an emergency board meeting to vote on Alexander's removal. When he arrived at Hale Tower, flashes from the cameras lit up the street like lightning. He ignored every question, every insult, and walked straight into the conference room. The air was thick with tension. Victor smirked from the far end of the table. "Alexander, your wife's sudden disappearance has only confirmed what everyone already suspects. This marriage was a stunt, and your leadership is compromised." Alexander did not flinch. "You want my seat, Victor. That is clear, but before this board decides who I am, you should hear the truth from the person who risked everything to stand next to me." He turned toward the door. For a moment, silence reigned. Then Evelyn stepped inside. She looked composed, wearing a simple black dress, her hair pulled back. The room went still. "Mrs. Hale," Victor said mockingly. "Come to save your husband's legacy?" She met his gaze calmly. "No. I came to remind all of you what integrity looks like." Then she faced the board. "Yes, our marriage began as a contract. I was hired to help stabilize his public image. But what I found was not a scandal. It was a man who forgot what living meant, and a company that lost sight of its humanity. He did not fake his death to deceive anyone. He was left for dead by people who found profit in his absence." Gasps rippled through the room. She placed a small flash drive on the table. "These are internal emails Victor sent to the media to leak the contract. You wanted him gone because you cannot control him." The color drained from Victor's face. The board erupted with murmurs. Alexander stared at her, speechless. She turned toward him, her voice steady but soft. "I am not here to save you, Alexander. You can do that yourself. I am just here to make sure the truth is not buried again." The chairman, pale and shaken, called for a recess. Security escorted Victor out as reporters flooded the lobby. When it was over, Alexander found her standing by the window, the city stretching out beneath them. "You did not have to come," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "You are right. I did not. But I could not let someone else write the ending." He stepped closer, his voice low. "Then let me write a new one with you in it." She looked up at him, tears glimmering but unshed. "You already did, Alexander. You just did not know it." Outside, the storm clouds finally broke, sunlight spilling through the glass walls. For the first time, he reached for her hand without hesitation. "Thank you," he whispered. "For saving more than my name." She squeezed his hand gently. "You saved yourself. I only reminded you how." The city hummed below, alive and bright again, as if both of them had finally remembered what it felt like to breathe. Weeks passed, and the world slowly moved on from the scandal. The board reinstated Alexander as CEO, but this time, his focus had shifted. The company's newest campaign centered not on profit but on rebuilding lives, on the belief that second chances could change everything. Evelyn returned to writing, but her words carried a new warmth, a pulse of truth she had learned the hard way. They still lived in the penthouse, though the contract that once bound them had been torn apart. Neither of them mentioned the word marriage again, but everything they did spoke it. Mornings became quieter, softer. She would sit by the balcony with her coffee while he read the paper beside her. Sometimes he played the piano, and she would hum along, lost in the peace they had earned. One evening, as the city lights began to flicker, Alexander appeared at her study door holding something behind his back. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. She looked up from her laptop, smiling. "For you, maybe two." He stepped closer and placed a folder on the desk. It was the original eulogy draft, the one she had written months ago, now framed in glass. Beneath the last line, she saw a new edition written in his handwriting. He was not gone. He just needed someone to remind him how to live. She looked up, her throat tightening. "You kept this?" "It was never just words," he said quietly. "It was a promise. One you made for me before I even knew I needed it." He took her hand, nervous for the first time since she had known him. "Evelyn Hart, we started with a lie that became the truest thing in my life. I do not want a contract anymore. I want a future. Will you stay?" She felt tears sting her eyes, the same kind that came from joy too heavy to hold. "You do not even have to ask," she whispered. He smiled, relief and love written across his face. Later that night, they held a small ceremony on the rooftop garden, just the two of them, no press, no photographers, only the hum of the city below and the steady rhythm of their hearts. He slipped the same ring from the contract onto her finger, this time without witnesses, without pretense. "This time," he said, "no contracts. Just us." She nodded, laughing softly through her tears. "Just us." The skyline shimmered like scattered stars, and for the first time since their story began, there were no scripts, no secrets, only two people who had written their own ending together. The next morning, the sun rose over Manhattan, lighting the piano, the balcony, and the framed eulogy that now hung on the wall. Underneath his handwriting, Evelyn had added one final line, and he walked into the room. Their story had come full circle, not as fiction, but as the quiet, enduring truth of love found where loss once lived.